Hi, this is the mini lecture video for Psychology 333, Psychology of Climate Change and Disaster at University of Maine at Augusta. This video is for Unit 1, the Human Dimensions of Disasters, Terms and Definitions, Week 2, Vulnerability, Risk, and Exposure. So last week we learned about the disaster response cycle and some of the terms regarding what exactly makes a disaster versus a hazard, as well as the many different moving parts in a society that must be coordinated before, during, and after a disaster event. This week we're looking at the differences between vulnerability, risk, and exposure. These will be recurrent themes throughout the semester, so it's important to get the differences down now. When a disaster strikes a region, not everyone will be impacted the same way, and these three issues, vulnerability, risk, and exposure, pretty much explain the differential impacts. There are three readings, so let's do a quick overview of these. First, we have the Gotengo and Perez, Understanding Vulnerability and Risk. This is a slideshow presentation. CLIMA is a climate change center that is based in Manila. It's a regional hub for Southeast Asia, and if you're interested, you can read more about CLIMA at clima.ph. So this presentation gives a good breakdown of the terms that we're introducing this week and how they interact with each other. I'll direct you first to slide number 8. This formula that they provide in the slideshow is commonly used in disaster and climate change circles to understand and explain how different people will be impacted differently, even when they're basically living next door to each other. So let me give you an example with these terms. We're in Maine, so let's talk snow. We had an off-season storm last November. The snowstorm itself was a hazard. I live in a home, and so the exposure to my person, my individual person, was minimal. Even when we lost power, I still had blankets and coats and I had a building to go inside of. So the exposure to me from the snow was less than, for example, a homeless person's exposure could have been much greater if they didn't have any inside place to go during the storm. However, we're in a society, so we also look at infrastructure exposure, because that's how a society operates. The infrastructure to my house was exposed. It was, hit by the snow, and in fact, a tree fell in my driveway, so it was blocking that driveway infrastructure so I could leave my house. Roads, public buildings, power lines, all of these things were exposed to the storm. And so that's all part of exposure when we're talking about societal levels. Vulnerability. Personally, it was my first winter in Maine, and so I had very limited capacity to prepare for and absorb the damages of the storm. I even ran out and bought a snow shovel just as the snow started falling. I had very limited preparedness, and so my personal vulnerability might have been higher. When my driveway got blocked, I didn't have any way to clear it. Personally, my vulnerability was a little bit high. As a society, Maine actually has a pretty good capacity to deal with snowstorms, to prepare for and respond to roads get plowed, power outages get addressed pretty quickly, actually. In Tennessee, an inch of snow can shut everything down for days even, because there's just not the capacity to deal with the snow. Tennessee is more vulnerable to snow than Maine is, even though, and in fact, because the hazard is much less frequent in Tennessee versus in Maine. Now, all of these three things make up risk, or the likelihood of experiencing harm, except that we can and do work to increase our adaptive capacity for each of these elements. We have building codes that reduce the physical impact of the hazard. We have shelters to reduce exposure. We build up our capacity to reduce vulnerability. And all of these adaptive actions increase our capacity and therefore reduce our risk. In this presentation, you'll also see further explanation of the different types of vulnerability, specifically social vulnerability versus biophysical vulnerability. And both of these things will come up again and again throughout the semester. In the last few slides of the presentation, there are some really great graphics that discuss how disaster risk management and climate change adaptation interact with each other. And we can, to some extent, use our existing disaster management models to address some of the issues that are arising with climate change. So take some time to explore these illustrations a bit. Is kind of an introduction to the topics that we'll be considering throughout the semester. Next we have Disasters by Design, Chapter 3, Losses, Costs, and Impacts. The gist of this chapter is that when a disaster strikes, it breaks society. People die and societal functions stop, or they change drastically while society responds to the disaster and recovers from it. It's expensive, it's far-reaching. Most of this chapter covers the scope and types of loss that we see with different disasters. And then in the last 10 pages or so, the chapter talks about how exactly we measure losses associated with disasters. Now, the reason we're looking at losses is because we want to mitigate or reduce the impacts of losses associated with disasters. And by and large, we're actually getting pretty good at it. Now, compared to 100 years ago, we have better building codes. We have better emergency response systems. I know people make fun of the National Weather Service a lot, but in reality, it's really incredible what weather science is capable of predicting these days. And it really helps us to prepare for emergency weather events much more so than 100 years ago before we had all of this infrastructure. However, on the other hand, we have more people now, and they live closer together, and our technology has allowed us to build in certain locations that are vulnerable to disasters. And all of these kind of countermeasures will increase vulnerability, but even still, over the past century, we've had great increases in our adaptive capacity, and in broad strokes, we have greatly reduced our risk from disasters. Finally, I have you picking 3 chapters in natural hazards. I know that's kind of a lot, but these chapters cover different types of disaster events, including scientific overviews as well as case studies of the human dimensions, the human experiences of disasters. So pick 3 according to your interests, what strikes your fancy. And remember that we're trying to develop a broad understanding of disasters, and particularly the human dimensions of disasters for our purposes within psychology. You don't have to memorize every detail once again, and instead you should be looking to learn what you can and make note of things that you might want to reference back later. I would encourage you, as you're reading these chapters, to really focus on and be thinking to yourself about that formula for risk that we saw in the slideshow. Consider each type of hazard. What would be associated exposures and vulnerabilities for individuals, for society as a whole, and where might we focus in order to increase our adaptive capacity, again, as individuals and as society as a whole. And if you walk away from reading these 3 chapters with a good understanding of where we as psychologists would be thinking or working in terms of these human dimensions of disaster, you'll have a really good sense of where we can fit into this very large, broad, interdisciplinary field. For our class activity this week, and also next week, you'll notice if you're looking ahead, we'll be reviewing and providing feedback on the revised survey. I haven't revised it yet, but I'm going to try to have it up on Blackboard by this coming weekend, so keep an eye out for that. Like I said, this particular activity is going to extend over a couple of weeks, so there'll be plenty of opportunity. But go ahead and take a look, and as always, let me know if you have any questions. Call or email or stop by my office if you're in Bangor.